Hope you're having a great day, and welcome to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank studio as we continue to celebrate so many amazing people working across the state of Mississippi to make this a better place to live, work, and play. Hey, we're in the throes of hurricane season. It's been kind of a strange season. Of course, all through Mississippi, we just recently saw a hurricane, and then obviously turning into a tropical storm, sort of run up the spine of Mississippi, giving our farmers some big challenges, swelling some of our rivers. But for the most part, we dodged a bullet on what was really kind of a strange storm. And we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that here in a second. And then we're watching out in the tropics as we speak, as most of the models and most of the experts think something will form down in the Caribbean or the Bay of Campeche and work its way into the Gulf of Mexico. It's kind of a strange setup from what is called a Central American gyre, a CAG. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well here in just a second. But for my upstate listeners, I think you'll enjoy the show today as we're going to visit with Josh Morganman, who's the top hurricane chaser in the world. You can look him up on iCyclone on YouTube. You can follow him. He's also with Weather Nation, and he is, again, the top hurricane chaser in the world. It's been a very busy season for him this season, but not because of what's happening in America. He's done some international chasing this year. And as he and I have discussed before, this is supposed to be a backloaded season for the most part. So we may be headed toward a pretty busy October, but all of that remains to be seen. Without any further ado, let me welcome my friend Josh Morganman back to the Ricky Matthews Show. Josh, how you doing?
Good. Great to be back, Ricky. I always appreciate the chance to get on and hang with you. I see you more on the radio show than I do in real life.
I know. For good reason. Hopefully things will settle down a bit so we can get back together again. But look, you spend a lot of time in L.A. You have a business, Symblaze, a marketing company, and then you just recently built a house over the past year in Bay St. Louis. You got introduced to Mississippi as a result of the pandemic. You sort of picked this as kind of a central place to do your chasing from, and you fell in love, didn't you, my friend?
Oh, absolutely. I came here for the hurricanes, and I stayed for everything else. But that was the original plan was, it's the pandemic. There's no air travel. Need to live in hurricane country if I want to be able to chase hurricanes this year, because no one was getting on planes during the pandemic. And then, there's so many things about Bay St. Louis and coastal Mississippi that I really just almost immediately grew to love. I was surprised how quickly I adjusted. I've always lived in big cities my whole life. I'd never lived in a kind of a sort of a town or a smaller town. And it was amazing how quickly I adjusted to the new lifestyle. Totally into it.
As we've discussed in the past, you built, I guess, the second version of Hurricane House. So you had lived in the initial home that you leased called Hurricane House.
Right.
And then you built this fortified place. When I say fortified, I mean he built to gold standard. He has a really, really top-notch, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a second, but weather station that's at the right elevation. That actually was interesting looking at your data from Hurricane Francine. It gave you kind of a chance to test it in terms of barometric pressure and all of that. Let's hope you don't test it with an eye passing over your house, but it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time, and you're prepared for that in the future, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And when I decided to build a home here, I wanted it to be complete. And like you said, one thing was to make it hurricane resistant. Bay St. Louis, this town's been ground zero for some of the worst hurricanes in American history. Obviously, there was Katrina, but before that, there was Camille, which was the sort of benchmark American hurricane. Before that, the eye passed right over Bay St. Louis. So I needed to, really build, a home that's strong. It's in a neighborhood that was, it's fairly, I'm in Old Town, which is fairly high elevation for coastal Mississippi. I'm at 19 feet, which is enough elevation for almost everything, basically, except a Katrina. And like you mentioned, I built it to the fortified gold standard, which means it's super wind resistant. Although, you look at it, I built in a very traditional style. I'm in the I'm in the historical district of Bay St. Louis, and they have style guidelines, which is a really good thing. They want to preserve sort of the historical character of the neighborhood. And I totally embrace that, because that's one of the things that really makes me love coastal Mississippi, and in particular, Bay St. Louis, is the architecture. I love the kind of the old styles, so I went with those. But inside these walls, there's a lot of new technology, to keep this house, resistant to like extremely high winds. But wouldn't be complete, like you said, without the weather station. So I'm a block and a half from the Gulf, with very good exposure. So it's a great place to have a weather station, because given its location, it's pretty exposed, and that means that next time we get a big hurricane roaring in, this station, which is a research grade station, is gonna collect some really, really revealing data. And I really took great pains to make the station sort of scientifically valid. So, for example, one thing that's really important: the correct height to measure wind is at 33 feet or 10 meters. That's like the internationally accepted height for measuring what's called a surface wind. And so my anemometer, the thing that measures wind speed, is at 10 meters. It's actually on a big mast. So it's really set up to get good data, and I'm excited about that. Not to nerd out on your listeners, but just want to do things right here.
Well, it's fascinating. For people who have not heard us talk before, you grew up in New York. You fell in love with this notion of chasing storms at a young age. You became kind of a hurricane historian along the way, and you've done reality TV shows. You've really done it all. When you think about, for people who have heard of really major storms, Hurricane Patricia in Mexico. One that got a lot of people's attention was Hurricane Dorian. You happened to be in probably the only safe building on Marsh Harbor, and were presumed dead for a few days. But you have seen a lot in your short period of time, haven't you, buddy?
Oh yeah, I look back now. I've had so many kind of, let's just say I've had a lot of luck, because I've gotten out of a lot of crazy experiences with, relatively. I was looking back at my career. I've been chasing hurricanes for 30 years around the world, every hemisphere, north, south, east, west. In developing nations that don't have good infrastructure. I've been trapped in places for days after. And I've had very few physical injuries. Like, I've been very lucky. I've had some scratches and bruises, some cuts. A nail went through my foot in Belize. I dislocated my shoulder in Taiwan. A couple of things have happened, but overall, given what I've seen and what I've lived through, I'm really lucky.
Since the last time we talked, you went to Japan, and we'll talk a little bit about that chase on the other side of the break. Met up with James Reynolds, another famous chaser and weather guy, who is a competitor and a friend. So it's interesting to see you and James together on that really kind of dynamic chase. Of course, you chased Hurricane Francine, which again, we'll talk more specifically about it. But you went a little bit to the right of the comb and did this kind of zigzag thing, and it was a weird storm in that usually when we're having high wind at my house in Biloxi, when it's hitting about where it hit in Louisiana, we're seeing some pretty significant winds. And there were moments when it was just like super calm. Most of the wind in that storm was kind of around the core of the storm. Again, we'll come back to that here in just a second. And then, of course, we've got this thing that's forming out there now. And I'm curious to get your point of view about whether you think this is going to be the backloaded season that we all thought it was going to be. But just so that people have a sense of this who have not heard us talk before, you don't chase with a group of people. You chase alone. You are extraordinarily aware of the situation. You always put safety first, to the extent that a chaser can put safety first. But you're aware of what it takes to chase a storm. And what's amazing to me is the effort you go through to get yourself into the eye of a storm. That's sort of your goal every time, isn't it?
Yeah, the goal is to get in the eye, just because, scientifically, if you're collecting data, a lot of the really important measurements that you want to take of the storm are actually in the eye. And also just the experience is so cool, just going through like the most violent part of the storm, and then all of a sudden everything calms and then it starts up again. I've always found that really trippy, and like that experience just like kind of draws me back. And yeah, it is a game every time of getting into that center wherever it is, and sometimes it's a very remote place. Chasing in the U.S. is relatively easy. Because, in fact, I would say chasing hurricanes in the U.S., in terms of the sport of chasing, it's almost like a vacation because we have great radar. We've got great infrastructure, great roads. We have a lot of population density. Everything makes it easy. But when you chase in other, like in developing nations where the roads aren't good and the network is spotty and there's no radar and there's large stretches of coast with very little population, that's where you're really kind of tested in terms of hunting down the center of the storm and collecting the data. And those have been, for me, the most kind of exciting chases, the ones when I'm in, some very remote part of the world, and I managed to get in that center, collect really valuable data that scientists end up using to understand what happened on the ground.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you think about Hurricane Francine, and again, we'll get into the specifics of this on the other side of the break, but when you do a chase down in South Louisiana, it's a little bit like it being in some foreign country in a way. It's kind of hard because of the marshiness of it all. Hey, when we come back on the other side, we're going to pick it up. We're starting with going to Japan. How do you make a decision to go to Japan, and how do you do a chase in Japan? That's going to be fascinating to most people. We'll see you after this break with the top hurricane chaser in the world, Josh Morganman. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. I have with me my friend and the top hurricane chaser in the world, Josh Morganman. Josh, it's funny to me when I'm on these various weather blogs, and I'm a kind of a tropical weather nerd, so I spend a lot of time on the blogs. And every time you post something on X, somebody in those blogs is going to share it with the others in the blog. I mean, you're just kind of famous in that world in a big way. Josh said this or Josh said that, and people reacting to it. I know you're kind of used to it because you've been doing this for a long time. But even when you were over doing your chase in Japan, people were very aware that you were there and that you were with James Reynolds and sharing sort of chapter and verse of that particular chase. And that was a really dynamic chase, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was quite a chase, actually. I would say that was the sort of biggest chase of the year for me so far. I know we're going to probably get onto this, but it's been a very weird Atlantic year. The forecasts were completely, just like awe-inspiring. Like what the experts said was going to happen, and then it started with a bang with that earliest Cat 5 ever, Hurricane Beryl, which had that rampage through the Caribbean and Mexico and then Texas. And it looked like, okay, we're off to the races. And then fortunately, things just kind of died, and the activity has not lived up to expectations. Strangely, it's so hard to characterize the season because the U.S. so far has had 3 landfalling hurricanes: Beryl, Debbie, and then Francine. So 3 is actually well above normal. In a typical year, the U.S. is hit by, I think the average is like 1.7 hurricanes, which means you expect 1 or 2. So above normal impacts, but not huge compared to what was expected or what's been happening since 2017. Since 2017, the U.S. after there was the decade before that, between Katrina and 2017, the U.S. had a long sort of dry spell without any really intense hurricanes hitting the U.S. Starting 2017, everything's changed. Almost every year has had multiple devastating hurricane impacts in the U.S. So we've gotten used to that. So this year seems kind of pale in comparison. Again, a fortunate thing. But because of that, I'm all about hunting down the intense storm. So that took me across the Pacific to Japan.
And so you make that decision. It's interesting because you position yourself, you talked in days ahead, watching what the models said. It was, the models were really I think the models did a fairly good job with that storm, telling you that it was going to be a potentially really dangerous storm coming to the Japanese mainland. But somewhere along the way, you had to take a leap of faith and go, even hoping that scenario. Well, not really. You're not hoping, but you're preparing for the potential scenario that it's going to be a big one, and just at some point along the way, you pull the trigger.
Yeah, and I'm glad you made the distinction. I don't hope for devastating, big impacts. What I hope is that if it's going to happen, then I'm going to get right in the right spot to measure and document it. So that Japan, pulling the trigger for a Japan chase, it's always a big deal because it's a big investment of time. It's a big investment of money. It's just, it's days out of your life to get over there. It's always, you have to mentally steel yourself, and I've got to really be in the mood to do it, which I was. And I went over. Now, Japan, there's the mainland, which are the big islands, the ones that, for example, Tokyo is on. That one's called Honshu. There's another island called Shikoku, and there's another one called Kyushu, and those make up mainland Japan. Then there's a bunch of little tiny islands that if you look at a world map, they're just dots between mainland Japan and Taiwan. That's actually those little dots. There's like Okinawa is there where the U.S. has a military base. Those are where most of the Japanese typhoons happen. The ones that hit the mainland tend to be a little weaker. They're kind of like the hurricanes that hit the mid-Atlantic United States. They're not quite as strong as the ones we get down in the Gulf. So I was chasing mainland Japan, which generally is not as interesting to me, but this one looked like it was going to be stronger than usual, and it was. It really, really came in pretty intense, actually.
And you met up with James Reynolds. Tell people who he is.
So James he's a British dude who lives in Tokyo because his wife is Japanese. He's actually lived in East Asia for a year. He's a typhoon chaser. And just for any of your viewers or listeners who don't know, a typhoon is a hurricane. It's the exact same thing. That's just what they call it in East Asia. There's something weird about hurricanes that there isn't a global word for it. It's just in North America, we call it a hurricane, or, in Spanish, hurricane, but same thing. East Asia, typhoon. Down in Australia, they call it a cyclone, but it's all the same thing. This thing we call a hurricane has a million different names depending on where you live. Anyway, so James is another global chaser. His big specialty is that part of the world, East Asia, chases typhoons. He and I'd say we're competitors because in terms of the number of hurricanes that we've penetrated, meaning got into the inner core, he and I are the top two guys. We've been in the most storms. So we're friends. We're also competitors. We used to chase together, then we didn't for a long time. This Japan chase was the first time. It was like the band getting back together after a decade of not producing even a single. So it was kind of fun for us to get back together and do that. And it was funny. It was just like old times. We chased really well together, and it was a lot of fun, actually.
I've enjoyed following both of you, and he seems like a super nice guy. It was interesting. He brought a handsaw, and, you think about, you get into the eye of a storm, and if you're in the eye, obviously there's going to be devastation around you. They're going to be down trees, roads are going to be blocked. And he had the foresight to bring a handsaw, and literally you used a handsaw to get out of there, didn't you?
Yeah. And it's funny. He mentioned to me when we went on the chase, he's like, oh, I packed a handsaw this time just in case we need it. And I kind of rolled my eyes. James is always he has a little more, James, our styles are different. Like James wears a helmet and goggles when he chases. I don't, he has a raincoat. I just wear a tank top. We're very different. I tend to be a little more casual in terms of my equipment. And I remember rolling my eyes and being like, oh, that's James. He's always has all his equipment. Well, I'm eating that laughter because that saw saved us, because we would have been stuck for hours or half a day or maybe even a day down in southern Japan. But that little tiny saw allowed us to kind of after the typhoon get back up to the main city where we were staying. It was it was this little handsaw, just a little tiny thing that fit in a suitcase, and it made all the difference. So kudos to James for thinking ahead, and I apologize for ridiculing it.
It was kind of fun watching you do that chase, because you clearly enjoyed being there again, and you love the food, obviously. It's just cool to have that change of pace, isn't it?
Yeah, I love Japan. And this has been one of the sort of fringe benefits of just, chasing hurricanes all over the world is just kind of going deep into all these like other cultures and experiencing them and really experiencing them. When I go to Japan, I'm not hanging out at the tourist sites in Tokyo. I'm going to like random little towns where tourists don't go. So you get this really, whether it's Japan, Taiwan, Mexico, the Philippines, Belize, parts of the US, wherever you're going, you're deep into sort of like the local experience. Japan is super cool. There's some challenges. Not a lot of people speak English, so that especially outside of Tokyo, so that becomes the language barrier could become a thing because obviously I don't speak Japanese. The driving is hard because they do everything in reverse, so you drive on the left, and that takes about a day or two to get used to. Like every time you make a turn, you have to like really think. So there's just things like that. But there's other stuff that's really cool. Another thing about it, everything is on a smaller scale. So like hotel rooms, everything is very tiny. Everything is very, very tiny, very efficient. Every inch of space is like used thoughtfully. It's not like, when you're traveling in the U.S. hurricane country and you stay at like a Holiday Inn Express or a Hampton Inn and the room is like enormous. Like you just have like all this like room that you don't need. Okay, Japan is not like that. Your room is like there's just enough room for a bed and a desk. And it's like, obviously these are not fancy hotels, but these are the hotels that you'd stay in on the road. It's just really interesting. There's so many different things about it. The cars are much smaller too, by the way. I think a lot of Americans wouldn't like that.
Well, hey, one of my favorite places, my family's sort of home away from home, is the Turks and Caicos, and of course, it's also different. Everything's different. I mean, opposite when you're driving there, and they have a lot of roundabouts. That you have to go around. Well, man, when you approach a roundabout, driving on the left side of the road, you literally have to think hard to keep from killing yourself, man. I mean, it's crazy difficult, really. You never really totally get adjusted. And, when you got your family in the car with you and they're all laughing uncontrollably because of the perceived confusion of the driving, it makes it a lot of fun. Hey, when we come back on the other side with our friend Josh Morganman, the top hurricane chaser in the world, we're going to zoom in a little bit and talk about the most recent chase with Hurricane Francine that we in Mississippi experienced, and we'll talk about the setup that's happening down in essentially the Caribbean, Bay of Campeche, Gulf of Mexico. It's going to be a storm probably that someone's going to get. We'll see after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. I have Josh Morganman, the top hurricane chaser in the world, who has a house now, hurricane house in Bay St. Louis. He is officially a Bay Rat during the season. Of course, he has a place out in L.A. now and a very successful marketing company that really enables him to be able to work remotely with his partner. So it's kind of a good gig to have when you're a hurricane chaser running all over internationally, running all over the globe. More recently, though, we had the situation. We talked a little bit in the last segment about how this season has been kind of strange. We may be headed toward a period where it's going to tick up a little bit. And, of course, we had Francine. Francine didn't really get going until it got right on the shore of Louisiana. And I was really I don't know, before we even talk about your specific experience, it comes in, it becomes a Category 2 literally as it's making landfall. It zigzags, ends up like dumping a tremendous amount of rain in the city of New Orleans. And of course, I'm, as the former publisher of the Times-Picayune and NOLA.com, spent a lot of time there, know a lot of people there. And, if that had been a major storm, that would have been the worst case scenario for New Orleans, how it came in. And it wasn't. But there's been a lot of talk about the pumps in New Orleans and, preparation. Why didn't the National Hurricane Center do a hurricane warning for New Orleans, which would have triggered a lot of things? Just an odd storm in a lot of ways. Like I said before, that even though there were tropical storm gusts far from the center, the majority of the big winds are literally around the center. So for you, what kind of experience was it? A strange experience for you too, in terms of chasing a storm?
Yeah, it was a weird one. The thing that sticks out in my mind is as it was coming in, there were very sort of conflicting forces with it. So it was going over extremely warm water, and so that was giving it like just jet fuel. But at the same time, there was pretty strong wind shear over the thing, so it was pretty sheared. So if you think of the hurricane is like a heat engine, and it's actually vertical. It goes, it's a chimney that goes deep, like high up into the atmosphere. Wind shear kind of like rips the top of the chimney off and screws up the whole exhaust system, and that weakens hurricanes. So it had the warm water that was helping it. It had the shear that was hurting it. So it was these conflicting forces. So technically it was strengthening as it came in, but the system, like I said, it was very sheared. So it was structurally a little weird. It was, usually in a healthy hurricane as it comes in, what's called the eye wall, it's the ring around the calm eye, that has the strongest wind and the heaviest rain. It all kind of happens in the same place. With this one, the different parts of it were kind of not in the same place. If you looked on the radar, that the eye wall as it passed over us, it did not have the kind of wind I was expecting, but then we had really strong wind kind of inside the eye after the rain stopped, which is not normal. It was just a weird storm.
Yeah, the backside had a lot of wind to it. I mean, that's for a matter of fact, usually what we'll see here in coastal Mississippi is the storm surge will begin to build ahead of the storm. But because of the trajectory of the storm, it came in, as we all know, it came in almost like northeast coming in. So we didn't get that huge onshore flow that we would normally get if a storm were to approach the Mississippi Gulf Coast from the due south. And so we weren't sure what to expect from a storm surge point of view. The water did not rise in advance of the storm like we would normally see. But once the storm got well inland in Louisiana and that wind started coming from the southeast here in coastal Mississippi, the storm surge went from 0 to 4 really quickly. And then we saw the bigger gusts on the backside of it. But it was just from what we would experience here normally, it was a strange storm. Now look, in advance of the storm, we had nearly 4 inches of rain in Biloxi. And then for this storm, we had nearly 4 inches of rain for the storm. So during about a 3-day period, we had nearly 8 inches of rain in Biloxi. So the rain that they expected was pretty much what we got.
Yeah, and actually, the station at my house, I had almost the exact same amount. I had 4.5 inches of rain, so very similar to what you had. The peak gust, though, at my station was only 31 miles an hour, so it was a little like basically breezy, but nothing else. Now, as this came in, I was really thinking that this could have been another Zeta, that hurricane that really blasted the Mississippi coast in 2020. And that was the opposite situation. It was similar in the sense it was like a northeast moving Louisiana hurricane that kind of cut into Mississippi inland. So the setup was similar. Now with Zeta, I remember thinking, okay, it's just going to kind of unravel over Louisiana and Mississippi. We're just going to get kind of like, I don't know, the tail end of it. We got blasted. I mean, Bay St. Louis, roofs ripped off of houses. We got the strongest part of the storm. It passed right over the bay. And I know you guys out in Biloxi weren't much better off. That was I think a big surprise. Every coastal Mississippian I talked to after Zeta, every neighbor was like, whoa, was not expecting that. So this was kind of the opposite, where I think all of us were, I was really kind of wondering if it was going to be another kind of Zeta, and it just wasn't, man. We got lucky, just kind of, I don't know, just didn't get it together. It came in a little further west, so a little further away. That was part of the thing. I think it was not as healthy a system as Zeta. I think Zeta came in a little stronger and held together a little stronger. I think, just goes to show you, I think the big takeaway here for coastal Mississippians, or really anybody who's threatened by hurricanes, they're like people. Each one is really different, like everyone you meet is just a different personality, different behavior, does different things, says different things. Hurricanes are the same way. Don't think that the one that's coming is going to be anything like the one you were in last year.
Yeah, what was interesting about this one, I think our experience would have been a little more like Zeta if it would have stayed at that same trajectory, but it didn't. We got to Lake Pontchartrain and then it like beeline north. And so it really kind of saved us. I mean, we still had some impact and some experience here in coastal Mississippi, but if it would have, Zeta came in real low. I mean, just like North Harrison County. And boy, that was of course, North Hancock and then, of course, North Harrison County. And, it hit as a Category 3, and it maintained a lot of those winds during that path. Just shocked a lot of people. And, of course, the electric utility guys that I talked to for Coastal Electric, Mississippi Power, Singing River Electric, and so on, man, it was a power outage nightmare. That particular storm, they had some serious work to do to get back up again. This wasn't that, and hey, I'm glad that it wasn't that. That is for sure. You started out in Morgan City, and you ended up having to kind of move over a little bit because as you were watching it in real time, it was clear that to get into the eye, you were going to need to be a little bit east of your position.
Exactly. It was that stretch. I was chasing kind of from Morgan City to Houma and then down to Chauvin, I think is how you say it. Sorry. Like there's so many.
Chauvin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is the chase one. I try to make it a point to really pronounce place names properly when I'm chasing. This chase, I went through so many towns. I was like, all right, I can't learn them all. I was just on the road constantly moving around in this one. But that's where, I ended up is kind of deep down in the bayous as this thing came in. This is the hardest area in the United States for hurricane chasing, that kind of southern Louisiana, that kind of bayou country. It is very challenging. You alluded to this earlier. It's just very flat, marshy land. You could be miles inland and miles from the Gulf, and you could get taken out by storm surge because there's so little elevation and there's so many inland waterways and bayous that just start to swell. So the water's a constant danger, and you just it's tough turf down there.
Yes, there's a lot of this is going to be an interesting thing to watch as we go forward, because I notice there are more chasers now, more young chasers now, and when I watch them, and I don't watch them closely, to be honest with you, but when I do come across them, I notice that they're pretty careless when it comes to storm surge, and storm surge will get you, man. And I think, I think there was a storm, maybe was it this year that a bunch of them ended up on a bridge because if they had it not been for the bridge, there would have been a serious problem. It's going to be really interesting as more inexperienced chasers are out there. Do we see injuries, and do we see some being caught in some really bad situations? I'm sure you see that.
I do. Listen, I was a young, inexperienced chaser at some point, so I'm very, I kind of go easy on them. Here's the deal. Storm chasing it's an inherently dangerous sport. It just, if you're doing it, you're risking your life. And so every chaser has their own kind of their danger threshold and what they're cool with. So, and we all have different ones. I'd say I'm kind of in the middle somewhere. But I don't judge what others are doing. I try to encourage people to be safe. But I've done dumb things or taken risks that I probably shouldn't have. My thing is, I'm in so many storms, like a world record. I've been in 75 hurricanes. My thing is, since I do so many, the laws of probability are, if I'm living a really risky life, it's eventually going to catch up with me. So I try to just chase safe enough so I could live to chase another day.
I'm glad you do. That is for sure. Hey, when we come back on the other side, we'll talk a little bit about this kind of complex situation that's developing in the Gulf of Mexico as we speak, or soon to be developing in the Gulf of Mexico, as we continue our conversation with Josh Morganman, the top hurricane chaser in the world. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. I was showing Josh for the SuperTalk TV audience and YouTube and Facebook audience, it's a fly that it's a really good saltwater fly that I couldn't find. And I shifted the table just a second ago and it fell on the floor. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. I found it finally. This is probably foreign to you, Josh, I'm sure. But anyway, it's a big accomplishment for me this morning.
I was like, what is that?
So, it's again, most of the experts said from the beginning that it could, this season could start slow. What's interesting, not to get too nerdy, but there's this thing, and you can chat about this too. Maybe one of the reasons why Francine didn't get rolling, what you mentioned it, we certainly had this year some dry air that was getting injected into it. It did at the last minute kind of protect itself somewhat from the dry air. That's how it became a Category 2. But there's this thing called the MJO. It's a Madden-Julian oscillation. I said, just in a simple term, what it means is that there's a lifting of the air into the atmosphere as opposed to it being depressed. And during Francis, it was sort of a depressed stage. And this MJO, literally, it rotates all around the globe. Well, in the next week, and I guess maybe starting this weekend, I don't know the exact date, MJO is supposed to be here in this part of the globe. And what that means is that the air is going to be lifting, and when that happens, it aids in the formation of hurricanes. And then you have this thing called the Central American Gyre. It's really kind of always there. There's an oscillation that's down in Central America. And if you get a seed like a tropical wave or a tropical low of some sort that gets set up in that area, it can aid in the development. And typically, we've seen lots of CAGs. We get one just about every year, and they tend to be larger because it's a lot. I mean, the spin of that low is pretty significant, and it usually takes a little bit of time for them to form. It looks like that's what we're dealing with this time, isn't it, Josh? Another Central American gyre.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was a really good summary of what's about to happen. I think, hey, it's good to nerd out sometimes and just, give folks a kind of an understanding of what are the mechanics behind these things that sometimes attack the Mississippi coast, where they come from. Folks always talk about the African waves, the things coming off Africa. And that is important, especially in August and early September. But as we get into late September and into October, a lot of times it's the seedlings for these storms that we have to worry about are they're closer to home. Like you said, the Central American Gyre, these things kind of brewing right in the Caribbean. And I think climatologically, this is a kind of year where we have to watch that area. And that's what's concerning about what we're seeing in the computer models is there is a sort of coincidence of the climatology, the MJO phase, and also this thing over Central America, all of which are suggesting something in the Gulf, some kind of cyclone late next week. And the models are all the different computer models are kind of coming into agreement that there's going to be something spinning in the Gulf, in the kind of 7 to 9 day range. And right now, the range of possibilities is huge. Some of them bring it into Mexico. Some of them bring it the other way over Cuba and the Bahamas. And then a lot of them suggest that the U.S. Gulf Coast, possibly the middle Gulf Coast, is once again going to be having to worry.
And what you've pointed out before, and this is kind of interesting, is that when a storm hits an area, sometimes there's a pattern in the year. So maybe the Big Bend area of Florida might be, and climatologically, in other words, based on history, storms in the Gulf this time of year will tend to, and in some cases, tend to jut to the northeast. We've had storms there repeatedly. And then, of course, Louisiana, South Louisiana. I mean, in the Francine kind of area. That's not unusual at all to see 2 for 1, is it?
Not at all. And in fact, that's the pattern. When you look back at hurricane history, what you see is hurricanes pick a certain place and then they keep wailing on it. And I mean, all through history, you look at, for example, Florida in the immediate post-war years, 1945 to 1950, almost every year during that period, Florida had a Category 4. One of them hit Miami. One of them hit Fort Lauderdale. I mean, just crazy. 1950s, everything went up the East Coast and hit New York and New England. Not everything, but like a lot of hurricanes. The Gulf was kind of dead in the 1950s, except for one big exception, Audrey in Louisiana. But right now we seem to be definitely in a Gulf of Mexico phase and a middle Gulf phase. And I think Louisiana definitely, are the sort of the poor victims in this. Louisiana's been just getting it again and again. Francine is yet another. Starting 2020, Louisiana can't catch a break. Now think about it. If that pattern was just a little east of what it was, it could, Mississippi, hey, we've given everything that's been hitting the Gulf Coast, we've gotten off relatively easy. Given Mississippi's, ugly hurricane history, the fact that we've only had one Category 2 impact in the last few years is pretty lucky. And Zeta, it was a 3 in Louisiana. It was a 2 in Mississippi. It lost a little strength before it hit us. So I would say we've gotten pretty lucky, but the pattern is close to us.
It is close to us. So we'll just have to watch it. People just need to pay attention and be ready. All it takes is one. So plan for the worst and hope for the best. God bless you, my friend. It's been great to see you.
Ricky, always good to be here. Thanks so much.
You too. This has been Josh Morganman, the top hurricane chaser in the world. Look him up, iCyclone on YouTube. You'll be glad you did. Have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.